and pay my respects to elders past and present, and welcome you all. And we're very pleased to be partnering with ACOSS and UNSW in this presentation. It's been an incredible year, and it's still continuing to be an incredible year, and we owe a duty to all the people who've worked so well during COVID to learn the lessons from what's happened. I like to think of COVID as just being one sort of aspect of the things that have been thrown at us as a society at the moment. We have bushfires, we've recently had floods, and really learning from all of those experiences to how we can be more resilient as a people, and also what it means for government as well. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first presentation of the day. And that's going to be given by Hal Pawson and Chris Martin from the City Futures Research Centre at UNSW. They wrote the report COVID-19 Rental Housing and Homelessness Impacts, and it's their initial analysis. It's the first of a larger study. So I'll hand over to them. We're not going to have Q&A straight after, but do put your questions in the chat box. And as Carla said, we don't have much time, so if you like a question, indicate that with a thumbs up so we know which questions to highlight when we come to that short session. So over to you, Chris and Hal.
Just sharing the presentation. Hopefully people can see that. I think I need to make it a slideshow. There. Is that visible?
We can see your notes pages, Hal. Or the next slide, actually. We can see the next slide coming up if you want to try another way to make the slide bigger.
Hal, would you like me to take over the slides?
Yeah, why don't you?
Great. Is that working well?
Yeah, that looks good to me. Okay, shall I begin? So please click on to slide 2. Thanks very much. So this is what Chris and I are going to try to cover in the presentation. I'll cover items 1 to 3, and I'll hand over to Chris for 4 and 5. So I'll talk a bit about the housing market impacts and the emergency policy responses, and then I'll focus a bit more on the homelessness policy actions. Chris will then talk more about rental policy innovations and an evaluation of all of this so far as we can. And just to highlight that this is coming out of a research project under the Poverty and Inequality Partnership between ACOSS and UNSW. And this particular research project is also co-funded by National Shelter and Mission Australia as well. Next slide. So let's just focus a bit about on how the housing market has been impacted by COVID or was impacted during 2020. Next slide. So there's obviously a huge amount of concern that everybody on this call will have been aware of at 12 months ago, and it was clear that there was going to be a big economic shock, apart from the public health danger as well. And indeed, nearly 1 million jobs were lost early in the crisis, and unemployment rose by 50%. And that's not counting the people who are protected by JobKeeper. And the concern was that income losses that were obviously going to result from that would be intensifying rent and mortgage stress and prompting contortions in the housing market around potentially mass rental evictions, surging homelessness as a result of that, and probably a bigger concern in the financial pages of the media, the fact that house prices could be hit by this if significant numbers of owner-occupiers being made redundant might be forced to sell at whatever price they could get, and also landlords with tenants unable to pay might also suddenly find that that was their best option. And the Commonwealth Bank's worst case scenario projected a 32% house price drop over 3 years. Next slide. And indeed, there have been major impacts on housing and homelessness in the last 12 months. Not, at least not all, but probably not most, as expected. Certainly judged by property values, housing markets have in fact been, or are considered by the commentariat to have been more resilient than people had expected. Almost all commentators, forecasters 12 months ago were predicting something worse than has taken place. Worse, that's if you are a property owner and your interests are in maintaining values. So on the graph, just illustrating that there was a hit, but it was a very short-lived one in the early part of 2020, or in quarter two. Prices did fall, but that only lasted for a very short time, and they started to come back in the third quarter, and then really quite sharply in the fourth quarter. And we know from reading the newspapers that that's something that's continued, and it's continuing to accelerate, in fact, at the moment. Our report takes that up to the end of 2020. But in the midst of that, there's also been some really quite significant changes, and this is reported a lot in the media, that there's been much stronger demand for houses than for apartments, and so price trends have been different in different parts of the housing market. Next slide. What isn't covered as much in the media, it's not ignored entirely, but it's not covered as much, is the impacts on the rental market. But however, some of the divergences that are true in house prices are also reflected, or have been also reflected, in the rental market as well. And these two graphs are, one relates to New South Wales, and the other, or sorry, the one relates to property types, and the other one relates to the sort of geographical divergence in Victoria. And just illustrating the way that after March 2020, there was really quite this marked divergence where apartments were being discounted, or the rent on apartments was substantially lower by the end of September, whereas house rents initially were fairly flat and then started to increase. And as far as the geography is concerned, really quite a marked divergence again, which seems to have started a bit before the pandemic, actually, but it really widened after the middle of last year in rents for the rest of Vic, meaning the regional part of Victoria, and I think you would see the same thing for New South Wales, going in a different direction to the three lines at the bottom are different parts of Melbourne. Next slide. So what did government do to quickly attempt to respond in emergency ways? This is a kind of effort as an overview of the government actions at the federal level and at the state and Commonwealth, state and territory level, that had an effect on housing markets and prevention of homelessness. Some of these measures were not specifically about they were more about income protection than about housing and homelessness directly, but they were very important nevertheless in that. So these are things which are already very familiar to everybody on this call, I'm sure. Number 3 and number 4 are maybe a little less talked about, the access to super being allowed, and probably very important as well, but a little bit more subterranean, is the way that the Reserve Bank helped individual lenders to allow mortgage payment deferral programs, which really provided a lot of relief for homeowners and landlords. But 5, 6, 7, and 8 are the parts of the response which were more directly targeted to protection of people at risk of homelessness or homeless already, and we'll focus mostly on that in the rest of this presentation. Next slide. So I'm just going to go a little bit deeper now into the homelessness policy actions that were initiated by 4 state governments in particular. Not to say that the other states and territories did nothing, but there was a really big difference between what took place in New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria and Queensland, and the other 4 jurisdictions. There was far bigger response in the first 4 because of concerns about the spread of the pandemic in those states and territories, and the realization that there was a public health risk and a much higher public health risk among rough sleepers and homelessness shelter populations. Specifically about the scope for self-isolation and hand hygiene, all forms of hygiene really. So that resulted in what I think is still to me an extraordinary scale of response, which is that emergency accommodation was provided. We have been able to establish through this research, and it is not recorded in any government monitoring, to over 40,000 people. And I'll give you a breakdown in a minute to show you where that took place. And this was a huge and costly logistical operation. Mostly it took place in the early part of the pandemic, really in the second quarter of last year. But of course in Victoria, the second wave there created a new emergency, and so it lasted longer there. And street homelessness for a very short period of time was not reduced to 0, but certainly reduced to near 0, and in very short order, within probably a couple of weeks, or certainly within the month of April. Next slide. And I'm just going to finish by showing you some tables that come out of data that we collected as part of this research, direct from these 4 state governments, which is got various health warnings attached to it. There's a lot more notes attached in the report itself, which you probably need to read if you're interested in this topic, because all kinds of qualifications have to be attached. But these are the best numbers that there are, because the federal government didn't think this was important enough to collect data on it, which I think is surprising. So what we're showing here is this number of 40,000, which comes up at the bottom in the total row, is the addition of what took place in all 4 of those states. Unfortunately, we don't have a split for New South Wales between former rough sleepers and other homeless, because the data we had from New South Wales was much thinner. From the other states, the majority of those assisted, especially in Victoria, were not former rough sleepers directly. They might have been rough sleepers at some point before, but they weren't. They were coming from shelter rather than from streets directly. Next slide. So what this table does is to just show, if you look at the columns, what that meant in terms of the number of people who were being sheltered in temporary accommodation at any point in time. You can see these numbers are look at the total row. These numbers are a lot smaller. So we're talking about 40,000 people, many of whom were only assisted for a short time. And so there was a lot of turnover in this. The length of time that people were in emergency accommodation varied a lot from place to place. And in Victoria, you can see that in the 30th of September, that was actually a peak there, whereas in the other states, the numbers were much higher at the end of June, and they were tailing off after that. Next slide. And finally, this table is our effort to find out about what took place next, to track the effectiveness of efforts to transition people out of emergency accommodation into longer-term rental property. And so this table covers the 23,000 people who departed from emergency accommodation during that 6-month period. And at the bottom, if you just look at the bottom row, dividing those between 4777 who were assisted into longer-term housing, a mix of social housing and private tenancies. Again, unfortunately, we can't give a breakdown for the whole of Australia there because the New South Wales numbers are aggregated, and then the remainder, which is people who left temporary accommodation, but we don't. There's no evidence that they were assisted into a longer term tenancy. Not to say some of them won't have been, but others will have found themselves back in a homeless situation, I think. Next slide. And this is just over a slightly longer time frame, showing the point in time impact that had in Sydney, the city of Sydney, and in the city of Adelaide, and the big numerical reduction and proportionate reduction, even in city of Adelaide, in that period of time, from March to the middle of last year, but numbers back not too far below where they started, unfortunately, at the end of the most recent set of numbers we have, which is from January 2021 in Adelaide and February in Sydney. Next slide. And here's where I pass over to Chris.
Thanks, Al. Thanks, Brendan. I'll talk about rental policy outcomes, and in two parts, the eviction moratoriums, first of all, and then the rent variation measures that went with them. So this was a really one of the standout measures that were taken in the pandemic emergency, and it was the announcement was made end of March by the National Cabinet that there'd be a 6-month eviction moratorium across Australia. There actually, it ends up being 8 moratoriums because the states and territories went away and did their own thing as regards the eviction moratoriums. Most of them also extended their moratoriums beyond the 6 months, and in most states they're ending now. In fact, they've been ending this week in Victoria and New South Wales and WA. So the eviction moratoriums were they varied between the jurisdictions. There was variation in coverage and strength. No state or territory did a complete moratorium, and the table there gives a bit of an indication as to the groups who were targeted, the particular groups who were targeted, and the circumstances that received the most protection. Even though none of the moratoriums were complete and was quite a varied level of protection they offered, when we spoke to stakeholders as part of our research, stakeholders in the private rental sector like tenant advocates, we spoke to a real estate agent as well, some other advocates, the general feeling was that they were fairly, that they were effective, and in particular, they were pretty easily communicated to landlords and tenants and agents in that early emergency period where things did get a bit wild there for a time, and particularly just after the announcement when agents were telling tenants to raid their super accounts to pay the rent, there was a sense that the moratoriums did calm that fairly wild period down. We don't have, though, any data as to terminations of tenants. We don't have this outside the pandemic. We don't have a regular publication of termination or eviction data, which is a real blind spot in our monitoring of the housing system and how the housing system is going. So, but generally speaking, the moratoriums were thought to be fairly effective as an emergency response. Next slide, thanks, Brendan. Just a little further commentary there on the moratoriums. So the generalising across the varied responses of states, they were mostly concerned with protecting people who were COVID impacted. That was the term used in a few jurisdictions. People who were particularly impacted by COVID, they'd lost their jobs in the emergency, or they actually had the virus themselves. The way this protection worked was increased scrutiny of termination proceedings by tribunals or by a conciliation process before it gets to tribunal. So increased scrutiny of proceedings, and also restricting in some jurisdictions no grounds evictions. As the slides say there were some grounds that were still allowed, like if the place was being sold, just about every jurisdiction still allowed terminations to go ahead for that. There are a few lessons there, I think, coming out of the emergency period now for the sorts of things that could be done permanently, particularly the scrutiny that gets applied, that heightened scrutiny that's applied to termination proceedings by tribunals is something we could keep doing. And the turn away from no grounds terminations is also something that could continue into the future as a way of better protecting tenants. Next slide, thanks, Brendan. Looking at the rent variation frameworks that were contrived by states and territories, the general approach reflects what was originally announced in the moratorium announcement. When the National Cabinet announced the moratorium, the Prime Minister and other ministers came out and said, this isn't a moratorium on paying rent, but we do encourage landlords and tenants to negotiate, to talk about their rent obligations. And what happened through the emergency period was we had some frameworks enacted by states and territories that really extended that approach. It was about getting landlords and tenants individually to sit down together and talk about rents. Rather than, an alternative approach might have been for states to actually mandate some rent reductions across the board, or determine rent reductions on a application basis. But no, it was a negotiation approach that was taken. There were also jurisdictions that stopped rent increases, but as far as existing obligations go, it was mostly about parties negotiating. What we found when we looked in our survey data, and also when we looked at the other sources that were out there, other surveys that were done by Ahuri and ANU, and some data from the RBA and tenant groups, most tenants didn't get a variation at all. In fact, it's between 8 and 16%, depending on the source. A comparison might be to the number of rental properties that were subject to mortgage deferral arrangements. It's about 12% of properties would have had a mortgage deferral on APRA's numbers. It's actually a similar number. Looking in our survey, and this is in the research report, going into more detail, 3 to 7% of renters got a mere deferral rather than an actual reduction in what they have to pay. So it's most of those who got a reduction got a real reduction, but there's this proportion, 3 to 7% of renters got a deferral. That means they have to pay that money back on top of their usual rent coming out of the pandemic. So that's going to be 75,000 to 175,000 households. So it's numerically quite a large number. There were rent relief schemes that were created by states and territories. In some respects, these might have operated as a lever, as an encouragement to get landlords to agree to reductions, but they were pretty weak lever, we found in the research. Some of them, in fact, appear to have been undersubscribed, and it's now coming out in media reports and government reports that they haven't spent nearly as much on their rent relief schemes as they had originally budgeted earlier on, because they just haven't been subscribed by people to the extent that they thought. When we interviewed stakeholders, they were less satisfied with the way the rent variations went than with the eviction moratoriums. Landlords, tenants and real estate agents really struggled with this unaccustomed role into which they were thrust. Next slide, thanks, Brendan. So some conclusions, a bit of an evaluation on how Australian governments did in the pandemic. In the research, we've done a bit of an international comparison with Canada, New Zealand, the UK and the US, with a particular focus on the UK. There's a chapter on the UK and summarising its response. So that similar approaches at a high level in these countries, including income protection, some moves on eviction protection, and also emergency housing initiatives. If we're going to making the comparison as we did with the UK in most detail, we saw there that the UK did have a similar large response to homeless people and bringing homeless persons into accommodation. They did rather better on the longer term assistance than Australia did. Another difference too that emerges from the comparison is that our federal government was quite disengaged particularly with the housing policy responses. So it had a big role to play in income support, but on housing policy detail, it was largely absent from the responses. Next slide, thanks, Brendan. So what was some lessons coming out of the pandemic and the response? We can see from the emergency accommodation that responding to homelessness, we've got a bigger scale problem than is commonly conceived of in council rough sleepers, because a lot more people were assisted with temporary accommodation. We also had governments confronting the really precarious situation that our private rental sector was in going into the pandemic. This was a site of real vulnerability because so many households, it's 2/3 of households, 2/3 of low-income households in private rental sector went into the pandemic rent stressed, paying unaffordable rents. So that was a real site of vulnerability. And that's what justified the eviction moratoriums and the rent variations. Also, another major lesson coming out of this is how our social housing sector has over decades now been so poorly resourced that its capacity to assist people in urgent situations is really lacking. Next slide, thanks, Brendan. And a little bit more detail on that. As far as government responses go, yes, we had some perhaps surprisingly purposeful and effective short-term responses in housing policy, rental housing policy, like the eviction moratoriums and the emergency accommodation. It must be said though that there are gaps in that, and particularly the income protection part of the response from the federal government. There were people who missed out on that too, non-citizens and some casual workers as well. We did see briefly cities with much reduced street homelessness, and we also saw a preparedness to act quite urgently to protect people from homelessness through eviction. On the downside though, we did see that there's a weakness in the response, particularly around rent liabilities, and that there are people who will be struggling with debts going forward, coming out of the pandemic. We saw that the government's, federal government in particular, their engagement with building out of the emergency and the economic crisis of the emergency has been a home builder program that has renewed property inflation and not addressing the deficit that we have in the social housing sector. So it's not clear yet whether all the lessons of the crisis are being learned that will enable us to build back better, to use the phrase that's been commonly seized on as summarising the opportunity that comes out of the crisis that we all went through. Thanks.
Thank you, Hal and Chris. And I just want to encourage people to use the Q&A, and you've still got time to put questions there, because we're going to move on to our second presentation. And our second presentation is going deep. So it's taking one small aspect of what happened during COVID and examining that. It's going to be presented by Catherine Stuart from Lee Road Consulting. And Catherine's been working with us with the community housing sector for, gosh, a year now. She's been on the journey, the COVID journey with us. We wanted to ensure at the beginning of COVID that we learnt as a sector from the experiences, and we could also look at the impact that COVID had for our tenants and on our businesses. So the work that we're going to hear from Catherine about in a few seconds is about the impact of the Victorian lockdown on the sector there and their tenants. I just really want to highlight before we begin that this is part of a long-term project as well. We didn't really know what COVID was going to mean for us as a country, but also as community housing providers and tenants. And Catherine's been incredibly flexible and responded to what has been a very changing programme. I just want to acknowledge the funding from the New South Wales Government, Community Housing Limited, and the National Affordable Housing Alliance, who made this project worthwhile. And just to say that we've learned a lot. And one of the things I just want to highlight we've learned a lot about is about our tenants. And if anyone was under any illusion that if you give people who don't have much income more money, they don't use it wisely, then I think our research has shown that tenants pay their rent. I was only yesterday having lunch with one member who's fairly near the front line at a community housing provider, and she told me that their rent arrears were the lowest they'd ever been at the time when income support payments went up. So you know, it I think is a learning that we should not forget and let others forget. So Catherine, I'm going to pass on to you now so you can talk about the Victorian experience. Thanks.
Hello everyone. While I fumble around organising my slides, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Dharawal people this morning and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Should have that. Let's get that to work. Okay. So as Wendy's just explained, the research I'm talking about this morning was conducted for CHIA as part of a broader project to research the impacts of COVID-19 on community housing organisations and then consequently on the people they house. And the aim with this particular piece of research was to find out what lessons community housing organisations nationwide could learn from the experience that organisations had in Victoria last year, working through the extended lockdown. The research involved interviews with 3 providers who had experience with tenants who had been diagnosed with COVID-19 amongst their tenant base, and also a focus group with members of the COVID-19 working group convened by CHIA Victoria. And this research was enabled and supported by CHIA Victoria, and I particularly like to thank Jess Pomeroy and Jason Perdue for their support with this work. So this slide seems to go into, this slide goes right down into the weeds almost. The research that CHIA had done earlier identified a number of strategies that community housing organisations used successfully during the first wave and the first lockdown. And so one of the focuses with this research was, well, with a longer, more extended lockdown, what things might change, what things needed to be done differently. And as it turned out, not really a lot of things, which I guess is useful information for all of us. The things that came through were very practical things. On health information, a more extended lockdown made it really important for organisations to adopt a single source of truth, be guided by that single source of truth that they'd adopted, not worry about what other organisations or other sources of information were saying or doing, and just sticking with one single source of information. You know, and that was important at a resourcing level as well as a practical level. A second thing that came through was that those processes that everyone put in place at the beginning of a lockdown about how things were going to work and what protocols were in place to keep everyone healthy, that those don't just need to be put in place over a long period of time. They also need to be put in place consistently across the organisation, so everyone's clear about what they're doing in any particular circumstance. And how they're doing it. Thirdly, organisations discovered that they relied very heavily on tenants to follow health advice and do the right thing. And they learned through that it was very important to communicate with tenants clearly, positively and supportively. This might sound obvious, but in a crisis, sometimes the focus isn't always on communication. And fourthly, it turned out to be important to have good supplies of PPE to cover a range of scenarios, because what they discovered in Victoria is that you just don't quite ever know what's around the corner. Now, in addition, a number of lessons came out of this research that have a broader application for business continuity planning for a range of scenarios, other crises, natural disasters and so on. So I'm just going to run through those quickly. Some of the key things that came out are that focus on maintaining staff well-being. In the extended lockdown scenario, it became necessary for organisations to actually change the support strategies they had in place to do things like provide additional leave, to provide access to online programs and so on. So the implication of this is around planning, that if you're planning for a crisis, you need to assume that there might need to be different forms of staff support in place over time. Secondly, the hard lockdown in the public housing towers has been discussed a lot. One of the big learnings for the community housing organisations I spoke to was that you just can't plan logistics for a hard lockdown once it's already in place. The pre-planning is essential. Knowing what you're doing, knowing and being able to communicate that is absolutely essential. And this learning potentially extends to other situations like natural disasters where tenants are isolated. Thirdly, it's not enough just to have operating protocols in place. They need to be monitored and updated as new information or experience becomes available. In the extended lockdown, this involved, in some organisations, needed to restructure temporarily to resource that. So they needed to free up senior staff to oversight those reviews and monitoring processes. Another thing that came through was that crisis-related costs, in this case cleaning and sanitising, but in other situations they could be other things, do mount up over time, and they do need to be monitored, not just in the short term, but also because they point to longer-term viability issues or issues that might need to be taken up at an advocacy level. Organisations, around the tenant management side of things, organisations discovered that support organisations also took their own, every organisation, as we know, every organisation took its own decisions about what protocols to put in place. When it came to supporting tenancies, support organisations had different approaches. It took time for the community housing organisations to understand what processes individual organisations had in place. Sometimes there were gaps in the services that were available that the housing organisations needed to fill. A really important learning for the future is that support providers do need to be factored into the plan, into business continuity planning. Another thing was that organisations in the end relied very heavily on tenants to tell them if someone in their household was affected by COVID-19. while there are a number of other systems and processes in place, information from tenants, directly from tenants, was the only reliable source of information in the end of the day. And so that enabling open and two-way communication throughout a crisis with tenants is incredibly important. And finally, the process highlighted that when it comes to relationships with government, having good relationships with individuals isn't quite enough. Key government agencies need to understand what a community housing organisation does, its services, and its business model, so that it can provide the advice that those organisations need. So it can provide tailored advice in response to the types of questions that community housing organisations will raise. So lastly, and just very quickly, a few broader areas came out of the work where there are opportunities for the community housing industry as a whole to act collectively. There is a continuing role for the types of forums that emerged during the lockdowns for information exchange and problem resolution. But there is also a developmental role that those types of forums can play, looking at future scenario planning, not just around COVID-19, but in terms of natural disasters and crises in general, and developing collective approaches that the industry can take. There's an emerging question that's come out around how individual community organisations can work with others, so form protocols for joining up with others to address particular issues in a crisis. So for example, pooling resources for an activity, or one provider organisation providing backroom support for another that's in the midst of some sort of recovery process, whether it's a natural disaster or something else. There's very much a role for collective industry action to develop frameworks to support those sorts of agreements to be negotiated. The research also points to a large role for collective industry action in educating the range of government agencies. So not just housing agencies, health, local government are another two that are important, about the role and functions of the community housing industry. And lastly, one thing that this research has highlighted really strongly is the need for broad government recognition of the impacts of crisis-related costs on individual community housing organisations and their business models. By and large, community housing funding models tend not to allow for extraordinary costs, such as COVID-19 or as can be incurred in a natural disaster or other crisis. And this is an area for collective industry advocacy to take up and start to discuss with government in the future. So I'll just stop the screen share.
Thank you, Catherine. We're running a tiny bit behind time, but I think we can get through the couple of questions that we've got in the Q&A. I noticed we've got one in the chat box, but I'm going to suggest that question's a great one for the panel to answer. So just looking at the questions, the UK's Everyone In programme has given us a few, people have asked a few questions about that. One's a very particular one about whether or not the Everyone In programme, or indeed anything else you looked at, widen the eligibility criteria for housing options to include people on temporary visas. But I think the one that got the most thumbs up was what lessons a programme like that might have for Australia if it enabled more people to transition into longer term accommodation. So how, or Chris, I don't know which of you wants to answer that.
Yeah, I can say something about that. I mean, I think the eligibility question is an interesting one, and I think all of these initiatives that we've talked about this morning, actually, or the ones that we've talked about in depth, the rental eviction moratorium and the emergency accommodation initiatives in Australia, and Everyone In England was the same. All of those really put on one side the usual restrictions on who can be helped. that there wasn't the same discrimination that, for example, the income support in Australia was beefed up for most people, but not for non-citizens. So I think these are interesting programs, partly because they didn't discriminate in that way. What's the lesson from how it was that England's program was far more successful in transitioning people out of emergency accommodation into longer term housing? I mean, the biggest lesson I think there is that they were able to they were able to be more effective because they've got more capacity to do so, and having 4 times in proportionate terms, 4 times the amount of social housing does make it easier to deal with this, and that really paid off. There's also a more effective benefit system for supporting rents, so that it's easier to help people into a private rental tenancy as well, which in this country, in many capital cities is very hard to do because CRA doesn't provide a big enough assistance to fill that gap.
Thank you. And then the second question, I think this is the only question we've got time for now, is whether the trends you found in Victoria, the difference in rental price rises between the regional areas and the metro areas, was replicated elsewhere.
Chris, you want to take that one?
All right. What we saw was that there was the biggest impact in terms of a reduction in demand was for rentals was in Sydney and in Melbourne, and particularly in the inner and middle rings of those cities, which are the most internationally exposed. International students and workers and visitors just weren't here, and that's a significant part of those 2 cities, whereas other cities don't have the same degree of exposure. So Sydney and Melbourne stand out in that respect, and then it's outer suburbs and the regions saw some increase in demand, and Perth in particular. Perth amongst the capitals stands out as a much reduced vacancy rate and real pressure in its system there.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Hal, and also thank you, Catherine. It's now my pleasure to pass over to Cassandra Goldie, and we're going to really open this session up with a much broader discussion of both the reports and other things COVID as well. So, Cassandra, over to you.
Look, many thanks, Wendy, and to all the participants so far. Can I also acknowledge I'm here on Gadigal land and pay respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge the very specific impacts that COVID has had on First Nations communities. Can I also highlight for those on the webinar that right now there is an inquiry going from First Nations communities about the need for a voice to Parliament. And we have committed in solidarity with First Nations communities everywhere we go to highlight that it would be wonderful for you as individuals and organisations to make a submission to that inquiry to back the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And so watch out in the chat. We'll send the details through to you today on this webinar. Can I also thank, of course, the collaboration with UNSW and all the academics there. And Wendy, great to be hosting this event with you at Cheer, and to acknowledge everybody who has worked so hard over the last 12 months, people directly affected by the housing crisis, and all of those at the front line and all of those involved in the policy discussions. Again, encouraging all of you to please post your questions in the Q&A. We're about to have a panel discussion, but of course we've got a bit more time also for questions. And if you just want to make a comment as well, I'm happy to read that out so that everybody can also have a voice on these very important issues. Look, I'm really delighted today to be facilitating the panel discussion with 3 fabulous people. Can I firstly introduce Karen Perkins? Karen joins us today as a very strong advocate. She's been very active in the Raise the Rate for Good campaign. You've heard already about the importance of the income support changes that were made during the COVID period. And Karen has very direct experience about what it's like to live in poor quality and insecure housing, and also the experience of living in subsidised housing. So a very warm welcome to you, Karen. Secondly, we're really delighted that Dini Leonardi is joining us from Mission Australia. Dini is a Senior Policy Officer with Mission Australia, who's a partner in the Poverty and Inequality Partnership, with a strong focus on housing and homelessness, and also mental health and welfare rights. Previously, amongst many other important contributions, Dini was previously a human rights lawyer in Sri Lanka. And so very, tenacious and gutsy contributions. We're really thrilled, Dini, that you've been active in the steering committee on the partnership as well. So a very warm welcome to you. And thirdly, of course, Adrian Pizarski, who is Executive Director of National Shelter, a key partner with ACOSS, an NGO peak body focused on housing affordability and homelessness, and with a 40-year commitment to delivering better solutions in this area. So it's really great to have all of you with us. I think you're all off mute. And so I might just firstly come to you, Karen.
Yes.
To a little bit about what you've seen in the past, particularly over the last 12 months, in terms of your personal experience of the change in your housing situation and what got better, what got worse. And any observations you'd like to make about what you've been seeing around you as well in terms of the changes to people's housing situation.
Okay, so what got better is because I'm already in subsidised housing. I didn't have to worry about living in harsh conditions. I have lived in harsh conditions in the past, in share housing with a whole bunch of men who are not very hygienic and huge mental health issues and in and out of jail. And there's been some of them that have been working, so they sort of were not so threatening. But I didn't have to worry about any of that. It still feels like a miracle for me that I can live in peace without having to deal with all these personalities around me, like in my face. You know, it's one thing to work with them, and then it's another thing to be around them all the time. So what got worse was the uncertainty of rent increase. I'm not going to go too much into it because it is complex. I know public housing were exempt from rental increase, but there was no clear communication and reassurance that it wouldn't happen with people in, I'm not sure whether I come under social housing or community housing. That's where it gets complex. So I wasn't able to do research. I rang the tenants union. They said to me, it's very likely that the housing company that I'm with, it is within their rights to increase the rent 25%. It is within their rights, but whether they'll do it or not is a different thing. And that was very concerning because being on JobSeeker with the $550 a fortnight increase, that meant 25% of that means $75 a week or $150 a fortnight rent increase that I was concerned I might be accumulating a debt and may need to pay it back. So that was just the uncertainty of it. Of course, it hasn't happened, but it still is a bit of a concern because I'm still not, just don't know, you know, I just don't know what, if government funding is cut, the housing company needs to pay their costs and they just might put that pressure on people. I don't know.
So Karen, you've experienced the change in income because you're relying on JobSeeker.
Yes.
And has that been part of the question and uncertainty for you about what your housing situation might be? Is that part of it?
As far as the increase in rent and even though it didn't happen, no rent increase, but the way it works with a rent review every 6 months, based on annual taxable income, that's how it works. And I was concerned that.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I'm just concerned that, you know, because it increase the next review, they may, you know, anyway. I don't want to go too much into it. It gives me a headache.
And there's been a lot of change, yeah. So that kind of wanting to get some certainty is pretty important.
Yeah, certainty and clearer communication with the housing providers. I am pretty happy with them in other ways. They are very, very good. They approach the rent situation holistically. It's not about, for them, it's not just about paying rent and then you're forgotten. It is like a community and a system, and they try to involve us as much as possible so that we can get to know the staff and they can understand the tenants' needs better. Like once a year, we have an annual lunch where we get to hear all the stories, all the positive stories and tips on how to save money, and get to see all the other tenants. That's really nice. Yeah. So.
And I'll come back to you in a minute. I was wanting, Dinny, it's a very particular experience for Karen, and you've heard the researchers talk earlier about some of the key overall findings about change over the last 12 months. What have you observed both on the positives and negatives over the last 12 months during the sort of bushfires and then, of course, COVID and the pandemic?
Thanks, Cass, and thank you for the opportunity. And I'm joining you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Just to give you a bit of background about our services, last financial year, we supported about 170,000 people across the country, and 23,000 of them were supported through various housing and homelessness services. And before the pandemic started, we know that young people, women, particularly older women, and single mothers were at a higher risk of housing stress and homelessness. So with the pandemic, there were a couple of observations around domestic and family violence. It was probably linked to the bushfires as well. So we had a higher number of people coming to our homelessness services because of their experiences of domestic and family violence. For example, one of our regional services had 23 requests for services for domestic and family violence related homelessness assistance for June to December 2019. And that number shot up to 53 in the last year. So between June to December 2020, there were 53 clients experiencing domestic violence, and that's just one service. And because this financial year is still going, we don't have the final numbers yet, but we can see a clear trend of the increase in demand. Another thing that we saw is the number of people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds coming to our services, seeking support, including international students and people on temporary visas. In terms of our other services, when the income support payments were increased, we saw a decline in some of the clients that used to come to our services for emergency relief and other supports. But unfortunately, when the payments dropped in September last year and again in January this year, we saw those people coming back seeking support with food hampers or fuel vouchers and that sort of support. So with the rental protections ending in most states and territories this week, and the income support payments being cut, we are likely to see another spike in demand for our services. And the government's response to the pandemic was mostly in relation to addressing needs of people sleeping rough, rightfully so. But that also didn't address the metropolitan versus regional and remote areas issue, where you see a lot more of rough sleeping in metropolitan areas, but in regional and remote areas, the issue is around overcrowding, and when they're expected to self-isolate or be in long extended periods of lockdown in overcrowded housing, that's not a sustainable solution. So I think the complexity of the issue needs a broad range of responses. And we have been working with organizations like ACOSS to advocate for increasing the supply of social and affordable housing, but also to increase the permanently increase income support payments and funding for other complementary supports, which Adrian probably can speak to better than I can. But yeah, so those are the main trends, but without proper financial and other systems, we are going to see this issue escalate over the next few months.
So Jenny, you really saw a change in the people coming to your service directly related to who got income support and who didn't?
Yeah.
Change the income support, yeah?
Yeah, so with the increase of the payment, some of the regular clients that we were continuously supporting were able to afford the essentials, and with the drop in payment, we saw them coming back to our services. So there was a clear trend.
And have you seen any change for people on temporary visas? Is there any kind of sense that people are starting to get some income, or is that still very, high demand area for you?
So some of the states and territories had protections in place and supports available for people on temporary visas and international students. They were able to access those supports, but they are still coming through to our services. And also in New South Wales, I know that homelessness services had been extended to everyone. So it's not dependent on residency from 1st July this year. So there are some measures and some supports available to them, but probably not enough to address the broader issues they're experiencing.
Yeah. Thanks, Denny. Look, Adrian, you were right in the thick of a lot of the advocacy on the policy front. What are your reflections on what did we do well over the last 12 months, and where would you say we could have done things a bit differently to make it better?
Thanks, Cass. And just to acknowledge, on Cubby land on the Sunshine Coast, I think we did the first bit well. The emergency response was rapid, was expansive. The JobKeeper and JobSeeker were great measures. The moratoria being put in place were fantastic. All of that really helped. We got tens of thousands of people who were rough sleeping or in marginal situations better housed within weeks. That was fantastic. We did the midterm bit in a patchy way. The moratoria being rolled out were very patchy. The rental support was patchy. There was a whole lot of confusion, I think, about how that midterm process has gone. And in the long term, I think, like a lot of things in Australia, we're going to do it poorly. We could have been building social housing for a year now. As Paul Keating said, with interest rates at record low levels, we could have been building social housing till the cows come home, and we should be doing it now. But we haven't been able to do that, except in Victoria. Victoria has put in a very significant investment. We acknowledge that. So the other reflection is that the states, I think, have once again led the way around a lot of this. They've put in place the emergency situations. They've, in many cases, provided more money for housing across the board. Victoria has gone much further than that and done their own stimulus at a very large scale, and that's really welcome, and that will hold Victoria in good stead, although Victoria has some catching up to do. But on the social housing front, we had a very low level to start with, and we're not investing as we should. And I think if we want to look at, you know, the unfolding agendas that we're facing now around economic security for women in particular, social housing is something that we should have been doing for a very long time that we're not still doing, except in Victoria's case. So I think initially we did well, medium term, patchy, and the long-term stuff, it looks like we are just not going to do very well at all.
Any comments on a home builder at this point?
Well, home builder, well, I'd say there's been an overemphasis on helping tradies keep their jobs and money flowing through the building industry, and helping people who could probably afford to do a renovation a little bit further down the track, bring that spending forward. Now, to the extent that that's kept economic activity afloat, that's not a bad thing, but I think that money should have been spent on social housing. And if it had been spent on social housing, we still would have employed all of those tradespeople. We would have brought that work more quickly to bear, and we would have ended up with a much more useful product in the end, being much more social housing. The other thing we should have done that we haven't yet done.
That comment, cheer. Seriously, you know, just what a moment, hey?
Yeah.
Yep.
It's a major missed opportunity. And the other missed opportunity that we've had was we could have been putting people who were temporarily housed in more permanent accommodation in our rental markets through subsidising that by state governments, meeting the gap between what people could afford to pay and what markets demand, and at least securing our scarce private rental resources for people who really desperately need it. Instead, what's happening is a bit like a giant game of musical chairs in Australia, where the music's about to stop and lots of people are going to miss out on housing. We're going to have thousands and thousands of people who just cannot afford to rent properties that they really need. Now, that is in cities, but increasingly in regional areas. And our rental affordability index data shows that that pattern of rising rents in regional areas of Australia is probably most prominent in Queensland, but is right across the board. Western Australia, I think, is a bit of a different case because they've had a mining boom going on at the same time, and that's drawn a lot of people into WA, which has created its own housing pressures. We've also had, and people forget, 450,000 people return to Australia. So the loss of immigration has been compensated to a large degree by that returning expat community, and they are more permanent residents, so they've really been displacing people. And in the regions, instead of having people move to the urban areas, which they normally do, they've been staying put, and other people have been moving to the regions. So the pressures on regional markets have been twofold, both from their own population and from people coming in. We're hearing endless reports of people in Sydney gazumping people in Toowoomba.
Yep. And I've just, if we were to look where we're at now and the priorities for the future, Karen, just this, of course, the government talks a lot about jobs, right? The economic recovery, getting people into paid work. And we have a Prime Minister who says he cares about mental health. Can I ask you to comment on the link between your housing situation and, you know, getting paid work and mental health? Anything you'd like to say about that? Any message on that? To get off mute, I think we can do that. Thanks, Karen. And just if anybody wants to post these, we've got a few questions coming in. So Karen, go for it.
Well, when I was living in shared housing, my mental health, I was constantly in crisis mode. I was coping on a day-to-day basis, but I just was, you know, very nervous, and mental health wasn't very good at all. But since I've had some space and privacy, because there was huge amount of invasion of privacy in many ways. But my mental health has improved. I have the ability, or not just ability, I have the capacity now to think longer term instead of just day to day or hour to hour. Yeah, so mental health's definitely improved. It's been 5 years, probably, and with the supplement and with the housing together, probably the best I've ever been, as far as I can remember. Like, this has been one of the best years for me. I don't know how that's going to go when, you know, the financial side of things really hit again. In terms of looking for work, I don't know what the issue is. I'm ready to do work, but, you know, I've applied for well over 1,000 jobs over time and only got a handful of interviews, and just one of the unlucky ones, I think.
I think, Karen, when we've talked before, I was really struck by you saying, you know, that by having more stability, better housing, and, you know, and a more adequate income, it just gave you the, you know, more capacity, as you say, to then think about what you needed to do to try and pitch for work and that kind of stuff. It's
a sad thing to say, but because it's been a long, it's not, yeah, long journey, but now it's now only now when I have the basic resources like shelter and finances that I realise that I feel like I'm the best that I've ever been is, in a very, very long time. So it makes a huge difference.
Huge difference. I've got a comment here, Karen, from Therese Edwards. She said that the coronavirus supplement gave women the chance to relocate to be safe, feel safer, and to cease the practice of forced and unsafe sharing, the sort of thing you were talking about.
I've experienced that too, yeah.
And to have enough money to pay for a removalist, for example, you know, those images of 550 reasons to smile, that's something that the National Council of Single Mothers and Their Children was promoting a lot during the period, was, you know, quickly focused into talking about a place to have as a home. And Therese just wanted to say congratulations, Karen, on your unrelenting advocacy and deep respect to you. And so many people have been speaking up. So, you know, thank you. That's a big message from Therese and everybody here. There's a couple of questions too. One which might be good for you, Dinny, to just comment on. Can panellists discuss the issues about income eligibility limits for low-income social housing? I currently pay 25% of my income to rent in social housing in Perth, Australia, and the income eligibility limit is $450 per week as a single person, which I know is low and I feel keeps people stuck in poverty. So there's sort of this link between a feeling of being stuck. Do you have any comments about that?
Thanks, Cass. And that's an excellent question as well. So with income support payments, when the payments were increased, there's ample research to say that a lot of people were lifted off poverty, and they had enough funding to pay for their rent and catch up on the payments. So with the payments going down, and also with all the other cuts that are being introduced, people are likely to go back to the old rates or like with the $50 increase a fortnight, which is significantly inadequate. People are going to be pushed back into poverty. And with the Resurrect campaign that you are also running, we have been trying to get the government to understand the impacts on these people and how giving people an adequate income is not just beneficial for them, but also for the economy. So I think what needs to happen is for a permanent increase to income support payments, including Commonwealth rent assistance, so people can afford to have stable housing so they can focus on other things like education, employment, and other aspects of their life.
Thanks, Dini. Adrian, there's a question here also about the disproportionate number of older workers, being made redundant through COVID, and the limited prospects of securing meaningful employment. You can see with the graphs actually of who's getting back into work and who's not. If older workers are really flatlining in terms of getting back into work already. And how can we use this opportunity to push for the demand on social housing, which has been, a life journey for people such as yourself, and this deep frustration we've got that we, when you hear the experiences like for you, Karen, the difference that social housing makes, and that when you become an older worker. Comments from Adrian on that?
Yeah, it's not just old campaigners like me who can be, somewhat characterised. It's also the Property Council of Australia. It's the Master Builders Association, the Housing Industry Association, Australian Super, ACOSS. Everybody seems to say that building social housing is a good thing. The ACTU, indeed. So it's not just us. Everybody seems to agree except for the federal government. The federal government persists with this notion that it's a state jurisdictional matter. And until we can crack that and get some bipartisan support for a long-term social housing program in Australia, it's the best thing that we can do. We're going to increasingly see older workers squeezed out, because we know in pandemics or any kind of crisis, it's older people and younger people who tend to suffer the most. Women as well seem to suffer economically through these things. They are three groups that need housing protection, if you like, and social housing and affordable housing for different income groups are ways that we can make sure that those people can still participate as well as they can.
Adrian, just on that sort of, what are the strategic opportunities? Because it's a never give up crowd.
No.
That's why we're all here. Any thoughts on that front?
Well, I think we have to use every opportunity. I think the current emphasis on women's economic security is another opportunity that we need to be emphasising, that social housing is a part of that. People say that I must have a very sore head because I've been bashing it against a brick wall for so long, and to some degree that's true, but there are cracks appearing in that brick wall, and if more people get behind the campaigns that are around on social housing, on affordable housing, it's not just us. There are powerful private sector lobbies involved in this. Everybody can play a part and convince the federal government. Go and see your MP. Every time you see an MP and raise this issue, it's an important opportunity. And the other side of it is income. We mustn't forget the income side of it. If we can improve people's income, we can take some of the pressure off, but we must do both of those things. It's not enough to do one or the other. All of it's important.
Thanks, Adrian. And Dini, if you got a seat at the power table, you had Scott Morrison there and Josh Frydenberg there, and I think we're going to have Anne Ruston there as the women, the Minister for Safety as well. What would you want to say to them?
I think one of the main things is to increase the supply of social and affordable housing and income support payment, like Adrian highlighted. They go hand in hand. But the other thing would be that people with lived experience like Karen, who understand the system and have understand the complexity of how different layers of policy work, should have a seat at the table and be at the heart of policy and other strategic decision making. Thanks,
Dini. Karen, you've just entered the room. You've got to sit down with Scott and Josh and Anne as well. What would you want to say to them today?
that it's a sensible thing to invest in social housing. It's not only good, it's good, it'll give people jobs. It'll, I can't think of the word, like it'll do many things in one go, like it'll just solve so many issues, you know. It'll help with mental health, it'll help with employment, it'll help with, it'll help build the economy. And that's how I see it.
Yeah. Okay.
Then why they're ignoring it? Well, unless it's a deliberate attempt, to create inequality and keep, especially women, you know, just have a whole more vulnerable women at the hands of people that have got money. It's just so wrong.
One of the issues we've been highlighting this week as people, you know, there's about 1 million people who are losing access to JobKeeper. We don't know how many, but it'll be a large number of people who become unemployed and who will be relying on JobSeeker. And of course, JobSeeker is going back to that brutal $44 a day. And as you say, Adrian and Dinny, we don't have the investment that we need for low income housing. And we've got a lot of people who've got access to low interest loans, who've got cash, who are fueling the upward pressure on housing prices. That the government has decided at the same time as all those changes to give $2 billion per month in tax cuts to people who've got jobs already, and the majority of them are higher income men. So there are some good alternatives for what we could do with those $2 billion per month, don't you think?
Absolutely. Like, it's not the time. It's not that, you know, the wealthy don't deserve tax cuts. It's just not the time.
They don't need them.
It's
and
just
they don't deserve them.
It's just bad timing. And
everybody that I know who's getting a tax cut is saying, I'd rather that money be spent somewhere else. So I just want to thank each of you right now for all the ongoing advocacy that you are doing, the direct service that you are doing, and just assuring you that we're going to continue all together, I know, to highlight to the government that actually it is, yes, sometimes people's lives are complex, but some of those solutions are not actually. A decent place to live and be secure and feel safe, and enough income to cover the essentials of life goes a very long way. So thank you all. I'm just passing back, I believe, to Carla to conclude the event, and thank you to everybody involved. Thanks, Carla.
Yeah, thanks. What a terrific session. So thank you to all of our presenters and facilitators and that panel just then, an amazing amount of talent and wisdom in the Zoom room today. So thanks for coming, everybody. In the next few days, you'll receive a message with links to the reports and the recording of this. And we look forward to joining up with you again, hopefully with some change and good news. So thanks again and have a good day.
Thank you.